In the last class, I have discussed the definitions of business communication. And I told earlier that communication is a means by which organized activity is unified, behavior is modified, change is effected, information is made productive, and goals are achieved. It is nothing but the exchange of facts, ideas, opinion, or emotion by two or more person. That means with the help of the communication, generally the higher levels of the organizations express their views, express their opinion, express their ideas about the goals and objectives of the organization. That means about what they want to achieve are to be communicated among the different stakeholders. And it is the lifeblood of any organization. Without effective communication, the ideas or the opinion cannot be disseminated, cannot be transferred to the different stakeholders, and that's why they remains in the dark about the organizational objective, about the organizational goals. And the basic objectives of the organization I also discussed in the earlier class, that it is the transmission of the accurate message precisely to the proper person. That means proper message or the proper information must be transmitted through the communication to the right person at the right time. And it must be made in this way so that it is to be understood by the others and accepted by the others so that they can initiate actions. It also maintains the clarity of information among the individuals to make the employee knowledgeable and creates an image about the organizations, about the future activities of the organizations. There are different elements of the communication. First one is this message. That means you have to decide what you actually want to communicate. That message, the information should be clearly stated and transmitted by the sender to the receiver. The second element is the sender. Sender means who transmit the message. Sender must have the thoughts or idea that should be converted into the structured form, converted into a message, and then sent to the receiver. And whenever you wants to send something, whenever you wants to convey something, you must have to use some signs or symbols, and you have to select the channels through which that message is to be transmitted. It may be face to face, it may be over telephone, it may be through letters, email, fax, audio conference, video conference. There are different channels are available based on the importance of the message, based on the significance of the message. You have to select a particular channel to transmit the ideas generated by the senders. And the entire process of the communication is intended to reach the message to the receiver. Receiver means the person who receives the message. Sender and receiver, both of them have a great role while crafting the message to its accuracy. And the last one is the process of feedback. That means only the dissemination or the transmission of the information, transmission of the ideas is not sufficient until and unless there is an effective feedback system. So effective feedback system is one of the important component of the business communication. Today I discuss the process of communication. So whenever we talk about the process, that means it must have a starting point and must have an ending point, and it's a continuous way. It carries on, it goes out, yeah, in a continuous way. The first process, the first step of the process of the communication is the identification of the sender. Identification of the sender. This is the first process. What is the ideation of the sender? The sender is the person, who would be conveying his news, views, ideas, and opinion to the receiver. Therefore, sender must have an abstract idea which he or she wishes to convey. It is important that idea is must be backed by the sufficient fact. That means the sender must have the sufficient knowledge about the idea. So that means the abstract idea must be supported by sufficient facts, must be supported by the sufficient evidence. Then and only then the ideation of the message, ideation of the information can be possible. So the first step of the process is ideation of by the senders. That means he or she has to make a concrete message based on his or her knowledge and efficiency that is to be transmitted among the different stakeholders. The second step in the process is encoding by the senders. Encoding by senders. Only the abstract idea, only the ideation of the message is not sufficient until and unless this idea converted into message. Now the question is how you convert your idea into message? Through the process of encoding. So encoding is the process that converts an idea into a message. And it is this step is of supreme importance because the sender must be careful while encoding the idea. That means the sender must be aware about the way by which he or she encoding the idea or the abstract concept into message. Why the encoding is necessary? The encoding is necessary in the sense that means the message that you want to deliver must be understandable to the receiver. A good way to encode the message better is by keeping the message content honest. That means the in the process of encoding, it should be converted in such a form that must be understandable to the receiver. That means to whom you want to transfer in an honest way. In an honest way. After the encoding is over, you have to transmit the message. So, the third step, the transmission from the sender to the receiver. So, this is the third step, transmission from the sender to the receiver. After the message has been designed or after the message has been encoded, it is to be transmitted to the receiver. In order to transmit, the sender has to take the utmost care regarding the medium through which the transmission takes place. Different messages, depending on their nature, weight, and urgency, would demand different types of channels for being communicated. That means the sender must be very careful regarding the choice of the channels based on the nature of the coming message, weightage of the message, urgency of the message, and so on and so forth. For example, if the sender receives an immediate feedback, a verbal medium would be good. Whereas, if the message is too long and wordy, often written means serves the purposes. So that means the sender is very need to be very careful whether a particular message should be transmitted in a verbal way or in a written way based on their nature, weightage, and urgency of the particular information. The fourth step is the reception. Fourth step is the reception by the receiver. A receiver is the nothing but the targeted audience. Targeted audience means to whom you want to transmit the message. And through the communication or through the transmission of the idea, it established the relationship between the receiver and the sender. Both are equally important. The receiver actually understands, interprets, and tries to perceive the meaning of the message given by the senders. So, in an effective communication, the role of the sender and the role of the receiver is equally important. If the receiver is not in a position to interpret the information, understand the information, it is very difficult for them to act accordingly. So, as a sender, you must be careful what you wants to, what you intends to transmit, and by which way you wants to transmit the message. The next step is the decoding by the receiver. So, after receiving the message, it is the task of the receiver, it is the duty of the receiver to decode the message. Decoding by the receiver become easier if the sender had encoded the message in a manner suitable to the receiver. That means whenever you encoding the message, you have to keep in mind that to whom you are transmitting the message so that it can be decoded by the receiver very easily. If the receivers had performed the previous steps correctly by reading the message or listening to it carefully, decoding becomes easier. And it is the very crucial steps because if other steps are going on very accurately, but the defects of decoding, the receivers may not act, may not perform as per the requirements of the message or as per the requirement of the senders. So the decoding part is equally important as encoding. And the last steps is the action. Actions means accepting the idea and giving feedback. And this is the final step in the communication process. Actually, this acceptance and the feedback or the action step determine the effectiveness of the entire process. After decoding the message by the receiver, he may accept the project, accept the message, or reject the message, accept the information or reject the information. If he accepts the information, it is likely to act, he is likely to act according to the requirement of the message. If he is not tuned with the information, that means he is rejecting the information. He may move for the further conversation with the sender, so as to clarify the points of mismatch. That means I want to say whatever information you have transmitted, it may be accepted or may be rejected by the receivers. If he accepts the information, it is well and good. That means you are sure that he is performing according to the information. But if he rejects the message, that means there is a scope of further conversation. It may happen that regarding the some points, he needs some clarification. So that means you have to open the door for the further conversation by the receiver to the senders if any requirement of clarifications. And feedback is the loops that connects the receiver and the senders. Feedback is the backward process that bridge the gap regarding the clarifications of some points if it happens. So feedback also plays an important role in the communication. So without feedback, only the ideation of the message, transmission of the message, decoding of the message become meaningless. So feedback gives the opportunity to the receiver for making the further communications if needed. So these are the process of communications. It has generally 6 steps to make the business communication effective. Now, I discussed the different forms of communication. Communication may take in various names depending on the mode of communication, direction of flow, and place of uses. That means whatever form of communication you select as a sender, that depends on the mode of that communication, flow of direction of flow, and place of uses. And on the basis of these 3 pillars, the first forms is one-way communication and two-way communication. From the name, it is very clear to you In one-way communication, only the sender of information picks without any opportunity to the receiver for providing feedback. On the other hand, the opposite is the two-way communication, where the receivers have done enough opportunity to clarify the doubts, ask questions after receiving the message. Interactive lectures, meetings, delivering lectures in a class are the examples of two-way communications. It may be verbal, written, and non-verbal. In a verbal communication, the sender picks using words to convey information. And verbal communication is effective or required in the case of the urgency. That means when a sender has an urgency to deliver the information and receiving intend to receive the immediate feedback, verbal communication is effective. Delivering lectures in a chalk and talk process, not in an online. Speeches, face to face interaction are the examples of verbal communication. But where the communication, where the sender writes the whole words on a paper, or in the case where the sender needs to deliver lots of information, verbal communication is not effective. The sender has to be, it is to be written, the sender has to write through letters, email, notices, circulars, and transmit it to the receivers. So when you need to speak more, written communication is effective. And when you need to speak less, and in the case of emergency, in the case of urgency, verbal communication is effective. What is the non-verbal communication? Non-verbal means that is not written. Non-verbal means through our facial expression, eye movements, hand movements, gestures, postures, we also deliver some information. So these are the non-verbal communication. We are not talking something. We have not spoken anything, but through our facial expression, through our hands movement, through our eye movement, we also deliver some message to someone. This is the second forms of communication. And the third form, which is the very important for organization, that is the formal and informal communication. Formal means the when communication flows through the official channels, which is designed for the purpose of the communication. It is known as the formal communication. And in the case of formal communication, it is the responsibility of the sender, or the sender is wholly responsible for the content of the message. And another thing is that the formal communication is documented. Official letters, official meetings, official notice are the examples of formal communications. But when the communication happens informally or casually between the people of any station in the organization, it is called informal communications. Suppose that two person in an organization or two or three persons in an organization discussing the social issues, political issues, their personal feelings, it is the case of informal communication. And in the case of informal communication, there is no need of the official channels. And it is not to be documented for further reference. Personal phone calls, discussing some issues in canteen by the students or the teachers are the examples of informal communication. Both are equally important for the effective functioning of an organization. Formal communication helps to unite the employees towards the achievements of organizational goals. And informal communication helps the employees to develop a cognitive environment so that they can act freely, they can work freely for the achievements of the goals. So both are very important for the effectiveness of organization. The next category is interpersonal and intrapersonal communication. Interpersonal and intrapersonal communication. Interpersonal communication means when the communication is between two or more individuals. Basically, all the communication or most of the form of the communication is interpersonal. Whereas in the case of intrapersonal communication is internal to an individual. And in the intrapersonal communication, the sender and the receiver is the same person, and he also provides feedback to himself in an ongoing internal process. Suppose you are reading a book aloud. No one listen what you are reading. Only you listen what you read. That means this is the intrapersonal communication. You are thinking about something and acts accordingly. Is an intrapersonal communication because you are the receiver and you are the sender. But in the case of interpersonal communication, the receiver and the senders are different individuals and is the common form of business communication. The next category is internal and external communication. Internal means within the organization. When the communication occurs from superior to subordinate, from higher authority to the lower authority, or between the two people in the same hierarchical position, one manager to another manager, manager A to manager B, that is called internal communication. And this internal communication may be through formal channels or maybe from informal channels, maybe written, maybe spoken, maybe non-verbal. But when the organizations communicate with the outside world, with the external environment, maybe the suppliers, maybe the customers, maybe the government, maybe the media, it is called external communication. Advertisement, press conference are the examples of external communication. And obviously, in the case of external communication, the channels of communication should be selected very carefully, and sometimes it may be documented for further reference. And in the case of internal communication, in some cases, in most some cases, it is to be documented. If it is occurred between higher authority to lower authority, from superior to subordinates, it may not be documented or may not required to be documented when it is occurred between the persons of same hierarchical position. Okay. Now the question is how the communication can be effective. What are the principles you follow to make a communication effective? The effectiveness of any communication is calculated based on the understanding of the receivers. How closely the receiver's understanding matches the sender's intent. It has to be ensured that the communication reaches the receiver without losing its quality. Both the sender and receiver need to follow certain rules because the receiver and the senders are equally important pillar of any modes of communication. So both are need to be responsible to make an organized communication effective. The first principle is ensuring feedback. Feedback is the steps that comes last in the communication process, but it is of pivotal importance for making the communication effective. In the earlier discussions, you find that feedback is the last step, but it is the first principles of communication to make effective. You know that the feedback is the process by which the receivers of communication can clear the doubts related to his understanding, listening, and interpreting the message. Actually, the problems of communication happens during the process of communication due to lack of proper feedback system. Almost all types of conflicts, all types of doubts can easily be resolved with an effective feedback system. So, developing an effective feedback system first is the principles of effective communication. The second principle is that knowing the communication objective. The sender must have a clear idea about the process of communication. At the same time, he must have an idea about the reaction he accepts from the receiver. Regarding the use of the sentence, use of the words, choice of the words, the sender must be careful. If there is a deviation from the proper form of the communication, it may not be effective. The communication objective must be clear to the senders. Next one is the framing the message carefully. While framing or structuring the message, the sender is required to be careful. He must avoid technical terms. It must be clear and unambiguous language. Use of the proper grammar must be written in a precise form, and the honest delivery add value to an effective communication. Knowing the target audience. A single piece of information might be required to be conveyed to different people in different ways. That is to say, the same thing, the same information may be required to be conveyed, may be required to be transmitted to different group of pupils. While planning and structuring the content of the message, the sender must have the sufficient knowledge, the background, perception, ideologies, nature, and habits of the receivers. That means sender must know the pupil to whom the message is to be transmitted. Based on their ideologies, based on their educational background or professional background, their habits, their perception about the organization, message has to be transmitted. As a sender, he has to perform the sufficient homework regarding the purpose of his communication and perception of his target audience. He must aware about the reaction from the opposite sides. He has to anticipate that the objection may occur, And the sender is very much successful to anticipate the objection. He must select. It is easy for him to select the total proper communications process. And he is to be prepared to counter the objection. Sender must be a good listener, active listener. If the sender has not enough listening power, the feedback or the objection that may occur, the conflict that may occur after transmitting the message may not be resolved. It is important for the sender to listen so as to understand the receiver views even while the communicating a pre-planned message. The message may require alteration depending on what the receiver has to convey. That means, as a sender, you must provide the enough scope for resolving any clarification, any ambiguities, any objections. Interpreting or decoding the message conveyed by the speaker correctly has a huge role to play in making communication effective. As a sender, you have to keep in mind that the receiver not only listen or go through the words, he or she has to perform. So whenever you develop the content of the message, the receiver should be needs to be clear from himself or herself that what you actually intends to do. And the selection of the appropriate communication tools is very important. With the help of high-tech communication mediums, the communicator can make use of the modern technology for transmitting the idea in a more vibrant manner. So, communication tools must be carefully selected. And through communication, through your message, the receiver has no scope of believing that you are ensuring, you are implementing your authoritative, your bureaucracy. To make the communication effective, a supportive culture needs to be created. Your message must motivate the people in the organizational ladder. This ensures that their intention is to make communication work. So you have to develop a supportive culture. cognitive environment within the organization so that they can work freely. So these are the principles of effective communication, or these are the rules to make the communication effective. Okay,